In our 13.3 subsection of the Money and Banking chapter, this is going to be our last subsection for this particular chapter. We're going to continue with our money multiplier concept and run with it and then use it to explain a few things that are important to understand later on down the road. So let's go back and remind ourselves of the money multiplier, which we talked about in the previous slide, but let's go back and review it again. Remember, the potential of the money multiplier to create loans is summarized in this particular equation. If you take your excess reserves, that means essentially money that's in a bank that is above and beyond the legal requirement, which means that it can be lent out. If you take that money and multiply it times the money multiplier, that gives you the total potential deposits that can be created. Now remember, the money multiplier itself is a formula. And that formula was what? 1 over the reserve requirement. So let's go ahead and just make up some numbers. Let's assume that the required reserve ratio is 0.20. So how big is the money multiplier? Remember, the formula was what? 1 over the reserve requirement. So that would be what? 1 divided by 0.20. And you can either do it in your head or get a calculator. You know that number will be 5. So you take that number and plug it into the formula we see on our screen. So the excess reserves, let's assume that we have an initial deposit of $100. 80 of it must be kept, or rather 20 of it must be kept in reserve because we've assumed that we have a 20% reserve requirement. So if you deposit $100 and keep 20, you have excess reserves of 80. And the bank can lend out that 80, and then through the process we talked about on the previous slide, where it becomes the checking account of what, the car dealer, and then the checking account of Norwegian Cruise Lines as it goes through all these different loans, we realize that the formula up here on the screen, you would take the money multiplier of 5 times the $80 of excess reserves that are above and beyond the required reserves from the $100 deposit. 80 bucks times 5 gives us $400. So if $100 is in cash is deposited in a bank account, ultimately the banks will end up creating a total of $400 out of that original $100. So there would be what, $100 printed up by the government and then $300 created through the banking system. So that's what we both determined last time and then extended this time. Now let's continue with our money multiplier. So this excess reserves then is, we can think of it as lending power. A bank can only lend out the excess reserves since they're legally required to keep the required reserves have to be kept in the vault. So if banks have excess reserves, they can lend all of the excess reserves that they want to, but of course they can't lend any more than that. So if a bank has no excess reserves, then it cannot make any more loans. So the entire banking system can get to the point where it's quote unquote lent up, meaning it's made all of the loans possible by taking all of its excess reserves and lending them out. So there is a limit to how big the money multiplier can grow to, which is why the formula had a capped number. In the previous slide, it turned out to be 5 because we were assuming that the reserve requirement was 20%. Whatever the reserve requirement is will determine how big the money multiplier is, using the formula for the money multiplier that we did in the previous set of slides. Now, let's think about what banks do for a minute beyond just creating money supply, because that's not what we think of as their primary function. They have 2 major functions that are necessary for any economy to function. First of all, the banks transfer money from savers to spenders by lending funds held on deposit. In other words, the average person who has money saved from their, let's say, their earnings. So you earn $5,000 and you spend $4,000 of it and keep $1,000 and you put it in the bank. So that's your savings. Now, those savings need to be transferred to business people for them to use productively. Let's do a nice simple example. We have a person, like I said, who's earned $5,000, saved $1,000, so they have $1,000 left over they've put in the bank. We have a contractor that needs to get, I don't know, let's say a sophisticated nail gun system with a compressor, the hoses, and the nail guns for his carpentry crew so they can put roofs onto houses quickly by using, the automated, tap, 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 tap of the nail gun rather than doing it by hand. Let's assume that the contractor doesn't have $1,000. How is the contractor going to get hold of the money? Well, obviously, in my example, we can see what the bank is going to do. The bank acts as a middleman. It gets depositors to put money in the bank, and then the bank turns around and lends that money to business people to use that money to buy the equipment that they need. Now, of course, very seldom does it actually work out to $1,000 deposit equals $1,000 loan. Normally, loans are in much, much larger amounts, especially for business people. Like, let's say that you are a tree cutting business, and you need a big dump truck and one of those high-powered chippers in order to do your job. I mean, those trucks alone are over $100,000 each, and the chippers probably $30,000 to $40,000. So let's say you need to borrow $150,000. Because the reality is most guys who own tree cutting businesses can't write a check for $150,000, so they need to borrow the money. Now, depositors don't normally save $150,000. They might save $1,000 at a time, right? But if you're a big enough bank and you have 150 customers, each of which has saved $1,000, could you aggregate all of their deposits together and then turn around and make one loan to the owner of the tree trimming business? Well, of course you could. That's one of the primary functions of banking. Transfer deposits from savers to ultimate borrowers who are usually in the business class. So we've already gone through the fact that the banking system will create additional money by making the loans themselves, because everybody believes that their money is still in the bank even though the bank has lent most of it out. At least the excess reserve part of it has been lent out. But everyone still looks at their own bank account and says, yes, I have money in my account. So if you add all those accounts up together, you realize there's been a bunch of money created. Now, the banking system creates the additional money, as I just pointed out, by making those loans out of their excess reserves. Now, changes in the money supply may in turn alter spending behavior, because if the banks have all this money to lend out, obviously there's a whole lot more business people can buy a whole lot more trucks. So the total aggregate demand for the entire system can also change. In this case, shifting the aggregate demand curve upward from the fact that the banks have created more money than was previously in existence. So when the Federal Reserve is trying to think of how to manage all of this, they have to keep all of these concepts in mind, realizing that whatever money they print, the banks will, on top of that, create even more money. So they have to keep an eye on what the final result will be and print accordingly up front to begin with. And here's just a picture of the circular flow diagram. We won't go a whole lot of detail into it other than to point out in the center in orange we see the banks. And you notice the banks are standing between the green consumer box on the left and the business firm box on the right. And you notice consumers have income coming from the fact that they've sold their labor to factor markets. So income goes to the consumer. The consumer spends part of it as consumption, but saves part of it, which goes to the banks, and then the banks end up making loans either to consumers, back to consumers, who then spend it, or to business firms who then spend it on investment. So all of that, the banking system is a major part of keeping the entire wheel of commerce greased, so to speak, of making sure that the money doesn't sit stagnant in a coffee jar somewhere or under a mattress, like the famous saying of the old days. I mean, no one does that anymore, but at one time people used to be scared of banks because there was no bank insurance. So many people kept their money hidden in their house or buried in the backyard. Nowadays we put it in the banks, and the banks end up making very useful loans to business firms who buy equipment, and that stimulates the entire economy. So what were the constraints on that deposit creation? As we've already pointed out, this money doesn't grow forever, because as every time the bank gets a new deposit from, they make a loan to somebody, that person spends the money, and whoever they spent it with deposits the money, right? So a new bank gets a new deposit, but they can't turn around and lend all of that money back out. They must keep a certain minimum amount required by law as required reserves. So they can only lend out the excess reserves. So this process of lending and lending and lending down the road eventually peters out, because it decreases by the amount of the required reserve ratio every single lending cycle. So That's one of the major constraints. Now, let's go through some other constraints. What if people decide, because they're scared of the banks, decide to hold on to cash? They don't want to put money in the banks. Then obviously the banks can't lend out that money, and therefore no money is being created from the lending process. So every dollar held as cash reduces the total ability to create money supply. The willingness to lend. What if banks have depositors putting money in the bank, but the bank itself is scared to lend because the economy is in a recession and many of your customers are defaulting on their loans, so you don't want to make any more loans? Well, if you don't make loans, what happens to that money creation process? It, of course, slows down because obviously if the money's not lent, it can't be created. So that would reduce the money supply. Willingness to borrow. Remember, I gave the example of our tree cutting company owner who wants to buy a new truck and a new big wood chipper. Well, what if we're in bad economic times and he can't even keep his existing equipment busy? Is he going to run out and buy new equipment? Well, obviously not. So if businesses are not willing to borrow the money, or homeowners and consumers are not willing to borrow the money, then the banks obviously can't, through the lending process, create even more money. And then, of course, last but not least, regulation. The Federal Reserve has the legal power to determine how big the reserve ratio is, and we've already gone through the math using both 10%, 20%, and 5% to realize, depending on how big the reserve requirement is, you can either let money supply grow more dramatically or cut down on how much it can grow. So all of these factors will determine at any given time how much money is the banking system capable of creating through its lending process. And that amount obviously changes all the time, as all these other factors that are on your screen. Every one of those things are driven by what? Emotion and fear of, and also exuberance and confidence can change dramatically in either an up direction or a down direction for every one of these things. So the Federal Reserve is constantly trying to figure out where people are going, quote unquote, with these issues in order to make a decision as to how much money supply they will create in order to maintain a total amount of aggregate demand in the system. So last thing we're going to do, and I'm going to just do this briefly. At the moment, this is not a particularly important issue, but it may become important over time. Now, Libra happens to be one of the digital monies. There are several digital monies. Bitcoin, of course, is the most famous one, but all of them are mechanisms to constrain the ability to print money. I don't know how much you all know about Bitcoin, but the idea is somebody wrote a computer algorithm that makes it incredibly difficult to create more Bitcoins. Not impossible, but very difficult. And the whole purpose of this is to create a scarcity of something. Anything that's scarce becomes more valuable, right? But if you can print money willy-nilly, you could literally turn it into Monopoly, like a game. You've seen the money in a Monopoly game. I mean, there's literally thousands of dollars in the game, but of course it's meaningless money because it can't be spent on anything. We all recognize that money itself can be destroyed in value by printing too much of it. So we have to look forward to think about, is Bitcoin and Libra and all these other digital currencies, could they eventually supplant or replace paper money issued by government? This is something that we will be thinking about long term. But for now, I think that it's still a niche market. Very few people still play in this. Most people use the American money printed by the government, and then the banks use it to make loans. So that's what we've been talking about so far is the dominant way that money circulates in our economy. But obviously, long term, this could actually make a major change. And then last but not least on this issue, this slide, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it on testing because, like I said, it's such a niche market at the moment. The computer algorithm has a private key that identifies who actually owns the Bitcoin at any one time, and then how you can transfer it to someone else. So that's how we transfer Bitcoins. It doesn't do a bank transfer. So banks do not have Bitcoin in the bank and therefore do not lend out Bitcoin. Bitcoin is peer-to-peer, directly bypassing the banks. So that's why there's no extra money supply created by the Bitcoin the way the extra money is produced by the banking system through its lending activities. So we're going to leave chapter 13 behind and move on to chapter 14.